Greetings in the name of the Lord. Welcome. Grace be with you. Peace, shalom, whatever greeting works. I am Cullen Cressman, and this is my attempt at a podcast. Greetings, everybody. I am excited about this new book that we will be covering, and that is the Gospel of Matthew. So I'm going to go through this, and this is similar to Genesis in that it's a large book, so I'm not going to go verse by verse, verse by verse or chapter by chapter in the way that I've done other books like James, Timothy, but I am going to do more detail than the book of Genesis, simply because there's I'm going to intentionally map it out. So I will try to cover multiple chapters in each episode, but I am going to cut down. We have 28 chapters in Matthew. I'm going to do, including this one, 12 episodes on this book of the Bible. So and you'll see the reason why, kind of the map, the reason for that. So we'll just dive right into it. This is the introduction. This is so you can kind of get your head wrapped around the book of Matthew, all the kinds of things that we will be covering. And it's going to be a good time. So in Matthew, Matthew is not the first, at least in my opinion, other scholars' opinion, Matthew is not the first gospel written, but it is the first gospel that appears in the canon for the New Testament. And so one of the reasons for that, the first gospel written is Mark, written earlier than Matthew. And so Mark is the Mark is a source. You can see Matthew uses Mark as a source throughout his book, but he adds additional information, mainly teaching content that you have from Jesus, the sermons that Matthew has in his gospel. But Matthew actually fits as a very good first book of the New Testament, better than Mark. And so that's one of the reasons why you have it at the beginning. It is a very good bridge from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Gets you oriented. It has a lot of Old Testament fulfillment motifs going on, and that is one of the reasons. So I'm kind of just shooting around right now. But one of the reasons why I have the opinion that it has a specific target audience in mind. It serves now as a very good gospel to orient us from the Old Testament to the New Testament, talk about Old Testament fulfillment. But we don't want to lose a specific emphasis that I believe is there just simply because it's a good bridge. And so it does have a favorite way of talking. So Matthew loves to say, this was done so that it would be fulfilled. You find that throughout the Gospel of Matthew. He has a lot of Old Testament themes, characters, specifically Moses and the law as a main theme going on. You have genealogy, opening up with a genealogy. And so very similar to Genesis, a genealogy is a way of connecting one to the other. So you have a genealogy right from the beginning of the gospel that's connecting. In Matthew's gospel, he's literally connecting Abraham to Jesus. So you have the promise bearer and the promise fulfiller. You have this genealogy that connects the two. So you do have a good fulfillment idea and theme going on, but there's a little bit more to it than that, and I want to explain this a little bit. And so one thing that you should notice is that the Gospel of Matthew is actually arranged in a very strategic way. And so you have, in the Gospel of Matthew, 5 sermons. Now, this is intentional. This is something that you have that resembles the Old Testament law, the Torah, or the Pentateuch, whichever you prefer, is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the 5 books of the law of Moses. And so you have the law of Moses, and you have a lot of Moses themes going on at the beginning of the book, which we'll talk about in our next episode. But Moses themes going on, and then Jesus's first sermon is on a mountain, the Sermon on the Mount. And where did Moses receive the law? Was on the mountain. And so you have this real intentional trajectory that Matthew is setting. Is it's a law, it's a gospel for those who know the law, it's a fulfillment of the law. And so kind of to give it to you just right up front, and then I'll address it a little bit more, is I believe that Matthew is a gospel that's written for those who should have known the gospel. So the emphasis there is intentional, is that Matthew is a gospel that was written to those who should have known the gospel. This is a gospel that shows, and it's not the way that we use it today, where we see these Old Testament fulfillments. This was done so that it was fulfilled. And we look at this today as modern readers and we think, oh, thank you, Matthew, for telling us about this Old Testament prophecy. That's very nice. It's more so giving points of argumentation, and if you were in a court of law and the prosecutor was giving the evidence for why the opposing side should have known. They should have taken it more seriously. They should have paid attention. And so what you'll see that, in my opinion, is the point that the religious leaders serve. They are highlighted a lot in Matthew. The religious leaders in Matthew, I believe, serve as a needed audience for all future readers. But I believe that Matthew is writing, he's burdened with, and he's writing a gospel to those who are stuck in their ideas of fulfillment. They are stuck in their desires for what the Messiah will be or should be, and who the Messiah should answer to, and throw that in there. But I believe that the Gospel of Matthew is not just a biography of Jesus, but it's also a biography of those who should have accepted him. And so that's where we're going to be going with this. Matthew, I believe, was written at an earlier date than some allow. I believe that you can put it earlier than 70 AD. I believe you can put it in the 60s just fine. And the reason for that is some will put it in the 70s because of emphasis on rabbinic references and Pharisees having the main picture. But Pharisees were the larger group regardless, and so it's very natural that they would have had a more dominant presence than the Sadducees. Jesus had more in common with the Pharisees as far as a belief system than the Sadducees or other groups within Judaism. So I don't believe that that's a reason to move it. I don't believe that the gospel has to go after the destruction of the temple for there to be vivid description of the destruction of the temple. I believe that can be prophetic, no problem. And I also don't believe that the religious leaders that the audience that Matthew has in mind is a post-destruction, post-temple destruction. For listeners who aren't aware, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. So that's where scholars have the debate on Matthew. Is it pre or post 70 AD because of the different changes that went on, not just the destruction of the temple, but the different political changes that went on. Pharisees were already the more popular group, one because of the diaspora, the spread of Judaism across the world, but Pharisees had synagogues, those kinds of things. So they were spread out more. They were more accommodating, I guess you would say. Other groups, their religion, so to speak, is based more on temple. So when the temple is destroyed, you have a kind of a big shakeup going on. Now, anyways, that's I guess it helps. But when you're looking at the audience of Matthew, some focus so much on it being a Jewish critique, a Jewish emphasis, that they're saying they're saying Matthew is speaking directly to post-temple Judaism. And I believe that's too specific of a reference, and I think that it's too political of a reference. I don't think that the reason Matthew highlights the religious leaders so much is because of a desire for conversion, but more of a burden and a heartbreak that is true to the story of Jesus and the Pharisees, because it's a longing for. Jesus has a longing for. And you see that the character of the religious leaders, you see it take a very dark turn by the end of the book of Matthew, that Jesus desired them. He wasn't fighting them. He wasn't giving this strong critique. He was wanting them to see what they were supposed to have seen. And that's why I say Matthew is a gospel that was written to those who should have known the gospel. So I believe that it's fine to date the book early. I do believe that there's more evidence, internal evidence, than just the 5-book layout that is evidence for it being a Jewish audience more so than a Gentile audience. However, I believe that the Gentile audience would enjoy it, simply because of, as I mentioned earlier, good bridge work. Matthew explains a lot of things well. He also has a lot of fun references to non-Jewish leaders, but again, I believe, or non-Jewish people, but again, I believe that is more for the sake of a hint and a reminder for how the story is going, rather than an invitation to the Gentiles. So I do believe that Gentiles could enjoy it. That is something they would have. But also internally, you have mentions. The most obvious mention is phylacteries, which is you can see them in modern day, where you have the Jewish people that will pray, and they have a box on their head, a box on their hand. You see with mezuzahs, you have the Shema written in put inside these boxes. From Ramah says that you're supposed to bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall put them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That is what Jewish people would do, and this reference to phylacteries would be a specific Jewish reference, a cultural reference. And so for a writer to put that very specific cultural reference in there, that is a good evidence of who he is writing to, that he can assume. He doesn't explain what it is, but we can assume that it is a Jewish audience. And for that reason, I also believe that it being in Second Temple period Palestine is the best place to put the writing of this gospel. And so I believe it's right there in the heart of the New Testament world, and it gives us a very good idea of the teaching of Jesus, the heart of Jesus within his Jewish group, his heritage, and wanting to be Savior of the world, but specifically his people. That connection from Abraham to him, I think, is what's going on here. So we're going to go through the Gospel of Matthew. This is our introduction. We'll have a conclusion episode, but we're going to do 5 episodes that cover the sermons of Jesus, and the 5 episodes that are going to kind of cover the in-between meat between the sermons. And so that's going to be why we have 12 total for this book of the Bible. And that's the kind of the plan that I've got going on here for this gospel. So I'm excited to dive into the book. If you have any questions, or you're thinking about things long term, you have something on your heart, you're wondering about Matthew in the future, let me know that that information, I'll try to put a reference to it in a future episode, kind of answer it on the side, give a shout out here or there if somebody has a question. But we'll just be moving through like normal. Thanks to everybody who is continuing to listen, and I'm glad that we've got some fans here on the podcast, some faithful ones. Apple and Spotify keep me updated on who my friends are, so thank you for being friendly towards me. And if you have other books that you're interested in covering, just let me know. I'm going to be trying to crank through these pretty quick, just shooting to cover the whole Bible. So everybody have a wonderful day, and we will get right into Matthew chapter 1.